well as your hearts. Okay, so now um, I promised I'm going to take you to Morocco. So I give you the street sign, the road sign, only for a moment of flavor. That's all. So I'm going to start our story in a little village in southwestern Morocco. The name of the village is Arazan. There may be at the most 1,000 people who live in this village. It's an adobe village, meaning that the houses are all built nothing more than 2 stories out of adobe. They have to be very well taken care of in the rainy season, or they'll literally begin to wash away. And in this village of Arazan, a magical event occurred, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment. My dearest friend in Morocco, by today, after about 40 or 50 trips, I have the privilege of having many. But one of my dearest friends is a man named Raphael David El Maleh. He is the last Jewish guide in the whole Arab world. He's an extraordinary human being. And about 20 to 25 years ago, he began going to the villages where about 150,000 Jews lived until the late 50s, early 60s. Villages like this, adobe villages, dirt roads, simple life, where Jews had lived for 2,000 plus years. And he went to collect what was left, because when the Jews began to leave, and now you're going to all say, well, the Jews left, how come they left? He's talking about things being so wonderful. That's a different talk. I can't do them all in one. Why did they leave? You'll be surprised about that too. But when the Jews left these villages, they took with them whatever they could carry in their 2 hands. But as a result, clothing, photographs, books, material culture was left. And their neighbors took care of these things. And starting about 25 years ago, Rafi began, wherever he heard that Jews had lived, he would go to these villages, pick up the Judaica that was left, all of the personal items that were left, and bring them to Casablanca, where there is a museum of Moroccan Jewry, or Moroccan Judaism, which is second to none. It's an extraordinarily beautiful museum, and it has a tremendous collection. It can't show more than 10% of what it has. So he came to Arazan because he heard that there had been a Jewish community of probably 500 or more Jews. He came to this little village. It's just a little village. It's, as I said, dirt roads, one little main street, nothing fancy. And he walked in to the cafe where the men were traditionally sitting drinking coffee. And he asked, were there Jews in this village? Oh, yes, they said, of course. He said, well, was there or is there a synagogue? At this point, the men in the village said, we really don't know. We were either babies or we weren't even born when the Jews left, which was in the 1960s. But if you walk through the village and ask for Harim, the man in your picture, Harim knows all about the Jews. So Rafi starts to walk through the winding streets of the village, not sure that he'll ever find his way back out. And finally, he comes to this man that you see in front of you, dressed as he is in his long traditional jalabia. And he asks him the same question. Were there Jews in this village? Yes, Harim says, of course. Was there a synagogue? At this point, Harim reaches into the pocket of his jalabia, the one you see right in front of you, and he pulls out a long, old-fashioned wooden key about this long. And he hands the key to Rafi, and he says to him in Hebrew, Baruch haba, welcome. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you for 45 years. Rafi says, you've been waiting for me? At the time, he says, I'm not even 45 years old. What do you mean? Harim says, when the rabbi left, I was 15 years old. I lived next door. He said, Harim, here is the key to the synagogue. if a Jew ever comes to this village and asks for the synagogue, give him this key. And then Harim recited Shema Yisrael. Now, I bring my Kivunim students to meet Harim and to come to this village in the middle of nowhere every year because that story is an exemplar of the story of the relationship between the Moroccan Jew and the Moroccan Muslim. This man felt it was his duty to take care of that synagogue. He lived next door. 5 years, even 10 years. He could have torn down the synagogue and added some room to his house. He could have built a larger garden for his family. Nope. He took care of this space religiously. And he did so without knowing that anybody would ever show up to ask for the key. When my students leave their experience with Harim, they ask, did we just meet a saint? What was he going to do if Rafi had not shown up? Was he going to give the key to his sons and tell them to continue into the next generation? Today, Harim is about 75. He's got cataracts. He's not well in general. It's not clear how long he will live. And the answer is yes. When we go back to the village these days, participating in the greeting are his sons. Now, what's there? What's there? What is it that he was protecting? There's a little synagogue, about 9 by 12 maybe in space. That ark that you see in front of you, this ark has been dated by officials in the art history department of the Hebrew University at least 700 years old. And it's not retouched. That's it. And the Torah that was inside the Sifrei Torah, actually, there were two that were inside this ark, are today in one of several small towns in southern Israel where the Jews of Arazan ended up. But the ark is still there. And my friend Rafi, together with some money that we've raised, we maintain this synagogue because, as I said earlier, an adobe building can wash away in the rains. So you have to take care of it. You have to, build a better ceiling. When it collapses, and it collapses. But it's an extraordinary piece, an extraordinary story. I have recordings of Harim singing the brachot to the Torah. I have a recording of Harim singing a version of Shalom Aleichem for Friday night that I have never heard before, and I traveled all over the world. And it's really quite extraordinary. How is that possible? Because he lived next door, and his ears were open, and he did not feel a wall or a barrier. And if I tell you that this story in some version is repeated over and over again in villages all over the country, there were 150,000 Jews living in villages, never more than 1,000 in any village. So you have hundreds of these little villages where there was a Jewish community and where the nature of the relationship was basically exactly what I'm describing here, no different. Even today, because in these villages, obviously, for thousands of years, there are cemeteries. In those cemeteries, there are Jews buried. You might say, you all know, since you live in Great Neck, you know that a little over the border into Queens, we have a bunch of cemeteries that the Jewish community has neglected so badly that you can't even walk into them. Not in Morocco. Every one of these cemeteries in villages where there hasn't been a Jew in 60 years are protected, venerated, taken good care of, and in fact, with all due respect to our rabbi, when the rabbis are buried in any of these villages, the burial of the rabbi is called the burial of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, and the tzaddikim are worshipped both by Muslims and by Jews. If you're having a disease, if a woman is infertile, if you have a business problem, Jew or Muslim, you come to the grave of the tzaddik and you pray for some kind of relief. Sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't, but that's the power of what I'm telling you, is that this is both Jews and Muslims. It's really quite extraordinary. This is Harim when he was at his best. This is really a really beautiful man. Now, um, where does this spirit come from? So in 2011, in the new constitution of Morocco, it basically states the following. And let me just move things around a little bit. So if you diminish the size of the pictures on your right-hand side, you'll see all of it too, but it's okay. I'll read it to you. A sovereign Muslim state committed to its national unity and territorial integrity, the Kingdom of Morocco shall seek to preserve its diverse, indivisible national identity, its unity, which is built on the convergence of its Arab Islamic, Amazigh, or what you might hear of as Berber, and Saharan Hassani components, is nurtured and enriched by African, Andalusian, Hebraic, and Mediterranean constituents. In the Constitution, it is acknowledged the significance of the Jewish population of the country, which at its height was never even 2%. So it just gives you a flavor. And the flavor, I'm not playing on words of flavor, but in Marrakesh, where you don't even have 200 Jews left, you still have a kosher butcher in the old city in the Medina. In Casablanca, you have 6 Jewish clubs, all of which have kosher restaurants available and open to the public. One of them is the Beach Club that sits open all summer long on the Atlantic Ocean. You have kosher bakeries. You have kosher butchers, obviously. You have 13 synagogues and 27 of these butchers. And you don't have a Jewish community of more than 2,500 Jews, of whom at least 700 are in an old age home. So that's just to give you a flavor. And by the way, when you board a Royal Air Maroc flight, and as on most airplanes in the world, you're given local newspapers, if you take a copy of the leading daily newspaper of Morocco, Le Matin, you will see at the top where you normally see the date, you'll see the date on the Gregorian calendar, our calendar. You'll see the date on the Islamic calendar, as you might expect. But you will also see the date on the Jewish calendar. And if it's Rosh Hashanah, it will say 1st of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah. And if it's Chanukah, it will say 6th day of Chanukah or 7th day of Chanukah, whatever day it is. It just, when we passed through Pesach, every day of Pesach was marked on that newspaper. So you think about that for a second. The only place where on a general newspaper, not the Jewish Week, but on a regular general newspaper, there is a Jewish date is in the state of Israel. What does it mean to be in an Islamic country where now let me add some ingredients about the nature of the Islam in this Islamic country? The dynasty of the King of Morocco claims direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad. The dynasty of the King of Morocco is known in the Islamic world as the defender of the faithful. Now, it doesn't matter whether historically that designation is accurate or not. It is accepted within the overwhelming majority of the Islamic world. So imagine that you have a Moroccan king and a Moroccan kingdom behaving this way towards Jews who trace their ancestry all the way back to Muhammad. And here's just the sample near one of the Jewish schools, of which there are 6, 2 high schools, 4 elementary schools. Near one of them, there's a very well-placed kosher bakery that only sells cookies. It's sweet. But imagine that sign. I want you to try and sort of step out of what I understand are our assumed stereotypes. There's no hiding of this sign. And by the way, business in the kosher cookie bakery is not only for Jews. Or I said before about cemeteries, this is a small section of the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Marrakesh, which is at least 1,000 years old. And it sits right in the middle of the Medina, of the of the old city of Marrakesh, and it is one of the most venerated, respected, and well taken care of parts of the city. It's just extraordinary. This is the style of tomb that is used in Morocco and in many parts of North Africa. But if they were using our style, the attitude would be the same. And when I spoke before about how Jews lived, so half of the Jewish population of Morocco, approximately, there were, prior to 1960, we estimate around 300,000 Jews in Morocco. Half of them lived in villages. This is a very elegant village. In fact, it's a World Heritage Site called Ait bin Hadu, near the city of Ouarzazate, in the beginning of the desert plains that lead to the Sahara Desert. There was a Jewish quarter in Ait bin Hadu. I've actually been to Ait bin Hadu with a Israeli teacher who was working in an American Jewish school, who, when she stood there, realized that the picture of this village was on the wall of her grandparents' house, and that her family came from Ait bin Hadu. She actually had not even realized it, but there's no other place that looks like this, and it's quite magnificent. And on the other hand, life is as it was. This woman is gathering straw for her animals and carries it on her back, or would be carrying it on her head. And you can see, just from a flavor, the village, the buildings that are there. What you see in front of you is modernity stepping in, because adobe obviously washes away. So you see somebody who was a bit wealthier was able to build themselves a house made of concrete. Now, to take you to this scene, I want to switch for a moment and take you back. I want to read to you the document, one of the documents that I sent to you, that for me is probably the most important. And I'll just dive into it. Some of you read it in preparation, so now you'll have a chance to think about it. But what I want to explain is the following. This document was written by King Mohammed VI on the occasion of the establishment of a website that is called Project Aladdin, as in, the 1001 Nights. And the Project Aladdin website was created to both acknowledge and make available the first translations into Arabic of historic documents related to the Holocaust, including novels, including nonfiction works of history. As I'm sure you know, we as a Jewish community have been very critical of the Arab world as Holocaust deniers, really over almost this entire period of time. The only thing that we really never spent any time thinking about was the fact that until Project Aladdin, there were virtually no books about the Holocaust in Arabic. So, it's one of those situations where you have to wonder about ourselves. This was established by the king and by the King of Spain, together with a group of about 150 retired and active diplomats from across the Arab world, to bring a conscious awareness about the Holocaust to the Arab public. So the king issued this statement, and if you didn't have a chance to read it before, and even if you did, really listen carefully to these words. I think that what I'm about to read to you is the strongest statement about the Holocaust that I have ever read. Praise be to God, may peace and blessings be upon his prophets and messengers. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what a myth to invite us of modern history. An unusual choice can claim to have an understanding. Such concession or compromise deliberately selective. Amnesia has no effect. But I want to tell you, as Dorothy said, it's based in Israel and travels all over the world. We're studying the interrelationship between the Jewish experience historically and the native populations where we lived. So in Morocco, we have been traveling all these years. And about 11 or 12 years ago, Rafi, the guide that I told you about, who went to Arazan and found that harem and that whole story, he called me as he often does, and he said, "Listen, Peter, I'm on the campus of Al Akwain University in northern Morocco, in Ifran, about an hour outside of Fez, and I'm meeting here with a group of students who call themselves Moadon Mimuna. Moadon is the Hebrew word for club. Moadon Mimuna. And Mimuna is the sort of observance of the last night of Pesach in a unique Moroccan ceremony which involves both Moroccan Jews and Muslims. Um, he said, I think we should bring the Kivunim students here. I said, okay, no problem. And the following year, we took a day trip from Fez, and we went up to this beautiful university campus. It was then only about 10 or 12 years old. It's an English-speaking university built on the American model. And we met with this group of students who made up Moadon Mimuna. Now, when Rafi said this to me on the phone, I said to him, I didn't know that there were enough Jewish students on any campus in Morocco to have a sort of Jewish club. And he said back to me, did I say they were Jewish students? I said to myself, you're talking about a club that gives itself a Hebrew name and is made up of Muslim students? It doesn't compute, doesn't make any sense. And he said to me, this is a club that has devoted itself to the study of Moroccan Jewish history, Hebrew language, and Moroccan Judaism, because they believe that if the king says, as I told you at the beginning, that the Jews are more Moroccan than the Moroccans, then if you want to know your Moroccan history, you have to know your Moroccan Jewish history. It's like us waking up to the fact that if you really want to be an American and understand our country, you have to know the history of a Native American, which none of us know. And even more powerful. So I agreed. So we went to this campus. We walked around. We met these students. It was really very impressive. And then after an hour, we were getting back on the bus. And a young man who was then a junior in college, named El Mehdi Boudra, this is about 11 years ago, he came up to me. And remember, he didn't know me from a hole in the wall. We'd met, for whatever it was, maybe had 3 or 4 minutes of private conversation during this hour that we'd been on campus. He said to me, Peter, the students who are members of the Moadon Mimuna, the Mimuna Club, hold the first conference on the Holocaust in. So I call it a Holocaust conference because that's going to be very provocative. Let's have a conference to honor as a righteous Gentile, King Mohammed V for what he did. And in order to do that, to understand why it's significant, I'll bring a Holocaust survivor to speak. I'll bring a Holocaust scholar to talk about the Holocaust so that you'll understand what it was that he was protecting the Jews from. But we won't call it specifically a Holocaust conference. And that took place 2 days, one day on campus, one day in the museum in Casablanca. I brought students of mine who had studied a little bit more about the Holocaust when they were in college. We had Michael Birnbaum, who was one of the leading experts on the Holocaust in the country. He was the designer of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. He's a professor out on the West Coast. We had all these Moroccan students from campus and leaders of the Jewish community. It was an extraordinary event. And when it was over, and this is where I'll stop, when it was over, after the day in Casablanca, the students came up to me and they said, Peter, this was very powerful. We knew a little bit from Wikipedia about the Holocaust, but we really did not know anything. We would like to go to Auschwitz. Will you help us to go to Auschwitz? So I said, look, if what you want to do is to go to Auschwitz, I'll certainly try and help you. But in my opinion, if you want to take another step, you should come to Israel. This is 2011. They threw up their hands. They said, Peter, don't even say something like that. I mean, maybe someday if there's peace, but we're Arabs. Absolutely not. Don't even mention Israel. I said, okay, fine. I'll do what you want. I got back to New York. About 5 weeks later, I get a phone call from El Merdi. He says, Peter, how many students can we take on the trip? I said, what trip? He said, well, to Israel, of course. I said, what do you mean? You said absolutely not. He said, yes, but after you left, we had 3 weeks of meetings so that all of our members would have a chance to talk. And everybody said the same thing. If Peter can bring American Jewish kids to our country and treat our religion and our land and our language and our heritage the way that he does in such respect, the least that we can do is the same to him. And in 2012, we had a group of 20 young Moroccan Muslim students. It was the first, and unfortunately to this day, still the only time that there was a Israel Studies seminar for Moroccan students. I won't go into detail except to tell you that it wasn't a UJA trip. I took them to Ramallah. I made sure that they met Israeli Arabs who felt very discriminated against. I gave them as much opportunity to see the underbelly as they could. And if I were to tell you, as someone who has been taking American teenagers to Israel since 1969, almost every single year, that I've never been with a group of students who were more in love with Israel and more appreciated its achievements than that group of students, I would be underestimating. Okay, I have opened up a big topic. I have in no way even touched it, but I'm open to any questions that you have, and I'm happy to stay as long as there are people who want to talk this morning. So I'm all yours.
Oh boy, I am so excited by your talk. Wonderful. There are two questions that pop out for right up front. One is, what brought the Jews to Morocco? And the second is, you mentioned that the Jews took whatever they could carry in two hands. And we have this question floating in our minds about this ancient Torah scroll. Could you weave that into your narrative?
Yeah. So if as you have suggested, it is thought that there's a possibility that this scroll is a um, Moroccan scroll. And tell me, remind me where it was bought. Do you know? No.
We don't know. We
You
found
don't.
it in New
So
York.
the answer is the following. It's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that it would have been sold by Jews, let's say in Israel, that Jews would have taken it to Israel and then sold it. It's just unlikely. It's not something that Jews would do. However, not everything that Jews, you have to remember from the villages, we're talking about people literally packing whatever they could carry in their hands. So the rabbi took the Torah. In one case, and probably not only in one case, he wrapped the Torah around his body so that he didn't have to use his hands. And that's the way that he was able to get it out without without in the end having, I mean, because he would have had to carry it with two hands, and he couldn't afford to use two hands because that was all he could take. So my guess is that it is one of those Sifrei Torah that was left in Morocco, that an antique dealer found it, because obviously after the Jews left, antique dealers went to some of these villages and picked up a lot of Judaica faster than the Jewish community could gather it in a museum that didn't exist at the time in 1960. Um, and then it made its way into probably a member of your congregation who was traveling in Morocco and saw it for sale at an antique shop and bought it there. That's my guess. And a similar story could have occurred if they bought it in Algeria, or they bought it in Tunisia, or they bought it in Libya, or they bought it in Egypt. So that's just my guess about it. Now, the first question was, how did the Jews get there? So the after I'm done answering the question and we all hang up, you have to go and look at an atlas so you see what sits across North Africa. There's a big desert that you know from a few movies called the Sahara. And to give you a flavor of the Sahara, in the Sahara, the dunes rise 50 stories high. So it's gigantic. The Jews were merchants always, and they came across the desert thousands of years ago. And when you're a merchant in those days, you just keep going. Why stop? There's nothing to keep you in one place. You keep going, in fact, until you get to the ocean. And when you get to the ocean, you discover that you have a new job, because now you can be a trader. You don't just have to be a merchant. And that's exactly the reason that Jews came. Some Jews, for example, we have Jewish communities in Morocco, and I mean Jewish communities of significance. I mean, with Kabbalists who live there, etc., in Erfoud, for example, where which is right on the shore of the Sahara. So those people said when they got to the end of the walk across the Sahara, they must have said to whoever was the patriarch of the family making decisions, "This is it. There's a place here to have a farm, and we're not going any further." So, so that's part of it. And by the way, the Jewish story, let's remember the Arabs only came in the 7th or maybe even in the 8th century. So Jews were there from the time of the Second Temple. So the same thing is true for the Arabs. They also came. It's a bit of conquest, but it's also for business reasons. That's how they get there. Did I answer those two questions? Okay. By the way, you know what? We're not that many people. As long as people don't have noise behind them, I'm happy for you to, be human and unmute,
Thank
cough a little bit. At this point, Dorothy, is there another question?
you. Yeah, someone wants to know if you are recommending any Jewish trips for adults to Morocco.
So there really aren't. I mean, every once in a while, there's something that you might call a Jewish trip, but synagogues are now designing trips like this or groups of synagogues together, and I'm actually working with several right now, because the problem is that there's not a lot of expertise. Kivunim, my organization, has been asked by the Ministry of Tourism of Morocco, now that they're expecting a large number of Israeli tourists, who are terrible tourists, by the way, um, who will come to Morocco. So the government is trying to train their guides in Moroccan Jewish history. Rafi is literally the last Jewish guide in the whole Arab world, and obviously he can't work. He's booked often for years in advance. So we're now designing a program under the leadership of the Ministry of Tourism that will be part of the required coursework for every guide who is trained to be a guide in Morocco. And we're actually doing some training now of existing guides that we hope to start in another few weeks while there's still no business, and that will be done over video sort of recordings that we'll produce on sites. So then a current guide who will not be as well trained as young future guides on the one hand, but will know the broader material better, will learn the material. They'll actually be able to turn on a video on their phone secretly while they're on the bus and prepare themselves, but they'll know the material. But there really is not very much. You have to do it yourselves, and you have to basically, um, it's an extraordinary experience. I mean, it's not like anything else. It's really amazing. I mean, just think about the fact. I know that you're Reformed Jews and therefore kashrut isn't important, but from a Jewish sort of heritage point of view, think about the fact that my students are able to get more kosher food in Morocco than in any other country that we travel to, other than in Israel. I mean, it's really amazing, and so there are all kinds of aspects, or what you saw in that, when I opened it. Unfortunately, not all of some of you got on late and you missed it, but I'll send the link. This magnificent concert in the city of Essaouira, which is on the Atlantic, which was a 50% Jewish city. And you must understand, when you say there was a city that's 50% Jewish, that means that the town closed on Shabbat. Or I'll give you another example. Can I have a couple of minutes? And the Poles, and behind them, we were behind them on a bus, but behind them are trucks filled with all kinds of goods that people need. The traveling souk was created by Jews, and it was a Jewish institution. As a result, when the Jews were there, the traveling souk obviously didn't work in a Muslim country on Fridays, and it also didn't work on Shabbat. So there was no souk on either of those 2 days. Today, 60 years after the last Jewish souk existed, there is still no traveling souk on Fridays and no traveling souk on Shabbat. And everybody knows that it's because of Shabbat, even though there are no Jewish merchants involved in the travel. So it's just that, it gives you an indication of the degree of integration and the positive feeling that exists between these communities. Um, Andrea Zulay in this picture, in front of the ark in one of the synagogues in Rabat, where there are maybe 50 Jews left. Andrei Azoulay is one of the leading diplomats of Europe. His daughter, Audrey, is the Secretary General of UNESCO and the former Culture Minister of France. He is the senior advisor to King Mohammed VI and was to his father Hassan II. When you sit in Andrei's office, which I have had the privilege of doing, there's a door behind his desk. That's the door to the king's office. This is just a picture of my students one year. Andrei always takes an hour of his time to talk with them and answer their questions. It's quite extraordinary. This is a year of our students paying tribute at the tomb of Mohammed V. It's a mausoleum, extraordinary mausoleum. And I show you the picture not to give credit to us, but to tell you just the following as another example. The mausoleum is open to the public for people to view from on high. There's a platform that you can look down and see the tombs. Appreciated should chant in Hebrew that prayer, which is further on into the for Jewish history. Is a quote sent from Morocco by the king. Hundreds of Jews. There were hundreds. The point being that all of the sort of
revelations, and you didn't why did the Jews leave Morocco?
Is the answer. Preceding the establishment and the actual establishment of the state of Israel. Those Jews in Morocco. Somebody asked me before, I didn't really answer this. You said, how did the Jews get there? So the Jews who ended up in the villages primarily got there. But the other half of the population, another 100 to 150,000 Jews of today, meaning their ancestors, came from Spain, because the Jews were exiled from Spain in 1492. Some went north to Holland, some went to the Ottoman Empire, and others simply crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and came to Morocco. And those Jews in Morocco are called Megurashim, those who were expelled from Spain. And they are the only, by the way, sometimes people say, they use the term Sephardic, if they are Sephardic, if they came from Spain. That's Jews, falls under the sort of category. That's just a sort of cultural, was not an acceptable thing. They were culturally so unbelievably different. They are also, they contain within them people who are much more business-wise. You had some very wealthy Jews in Morocco and Africa in 1776, and many emerge from Moroccan family. America, a big involvement in the rubber trade, living in the Amazon. There's a lot of exotic stories that are quite something, and of course, the trade that existed between Essaouira, that was known historically as Mogador, and eventually Agadir. Casablanca did not have a port. These were major port cities, and there was enormous amount of trade between Europe and Morocco, because from Morocco you got everything coming out of Africa, and so these are very important points and places. Now, when you get to the pre-establishment of the state of Israel, you do have in Morocco Zionist youth groups, a la European Zionist youth movements. So you had young people, including Andrei Azoulay, who were in the Hashomer HaTzair, for example, the kibbutz movement, left-wing Zionist youth movement. And I've met Moroccan Jews in Israel who live in Ashdod in large numbers, who came in right after the establishment of the state as young Zionists. So that's one category. And by the way, I know that it's not on your, if you go to Israel to visit, you probably do not go to Ashdod, which is a port city. But if you went to Ashdod, you would discover there two streets that might surprise you. One is called Rehov HaMelech Mohammed HaChamishi, Mohammed the Fifth, King Mohammed the Fifth Street, and the
Oh,
other is called Rehov Melech Hassan Hasheni, King Hassan the Second Street, in an Israeli Jewish city, along with a memorial tablet in the major park in Ashdod in Hebrew and in Arabic, paying tribute to Hassan the Second. It's just, like things that nobody knows, but they're there. So when now switch. So in the let's go to 1956. Again, I don't want to open up a thing that's going to shock you, but when the Israelis invaded the Sinai after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, let me remind you that the Suez Canal was built and owned, quote unquote, by the British and the French. If I'm not mistaken, you will all remember that the British and the French were colonial powers who were in the process of being thrown out of virtually every place where they had been colonial powers in the from the period, let's say, of the late 40s into the 50s and 60s. So in 1956, Nasser, the great pan-Arab leader of the Arab world, nationalizes this canal that's built in the middle of his country, takes it away from the British and the French, and the British and the French use the Israelis to go and take it back. This did create a certain amount of tension within the Arab world and for Jews living in the Arab world. There was virtually nothing, that took place in the form of violence. However, if you were a Jew living in Morocco, and now you have a Jewish state, and you also have France where you are a citizen as well, you can move to France. You might begin to worry about what is coming because, ironically, Israel is going to get you into trouble, or at least could. That's one. Then, of course, you have a sort of growing nationalism coming out of Egypt, led by Nasser, which, by the way, Hassan II, as he was the king at the time, he never let Nasser come to Morocco. In other words, he didn't like the development of this pan-Arab nationalism either. But again, if you're a Jew sitting in your house in one of the big cities in Morocco, you might wonder, well, what's the future? Is the king going to continue to rule, or are we going to have a revolution? And don't forget, in 1956, in 1954, Nasser overthrew King Farouk. In 1956, the Algerian Revolution took place, and all of the French and all the Jews in Algeria, in contrast to Morocco, really were French. They were identified and self-identified as French. So they all got out of Algeria because it was dangerous. That was a violent revolution. And even in Morocco, there was a revolution against the French. It was virtually not violent, but it was strong, and it had Jewish participation, active participation, in a real way. But nonetheless, there's an unsettling feeling in the whole area. And even if Morocco and the heads of the government say to you, there's nothing for you to be concerned about or worried about, Jews like to worry. And when you couple that with the fact that the Jewish state of Israel sent emissaries, shlichim, into the villages and into the cities and said to Jews in 1960 in particular and the next couple of years, this is the time. L'shana haba Yerushalayim has arrived. We need you. We want you. You need to get out. There's no future here. And you work at that. A combination of messianism, a little Zionism, some kind of practical thinking and reality, people pick up and leave, which they did. And the greatest loyalty to Morocco is amongst Moroccans all over the world. And they are all considered citizens of Morocco. They are able to get full citizenship if they want it, whether they live in Morocco or not. So they have a relationship. When I go to an event of the Moroccan Jewish community in New York, usually held at the Center for Jewish History, On the stage is always a portrait of the king, and before anything else happens, they sing the national anthem. So there's no feeling like you'll get from Jews from Iraq or Iran, where they were feel that they were thrown out and they're they're angry, etc. It's not the case in Morocco. There's almost no existence, no story of that kind.
Okay.
You're muted, Dorothy.
I would strongly recommend to all of our congregation who are still on here and those who are not, to watch the video, the movie that you sent, because it will give us more of an enlightenment on what happened in the 60s and why the Jews left, although you summarized it quite.
And by the way, um, since I sent you that link, there was an article which I'll send you as well. There was a big article in the New York Times about the filmmaker's newest film,
Oh.
which is about a young Israeli singer whose name is Netta El Kayam, and she is an extraordinary singer of Moroccan Jewish music, but Moroccan Jewish music is also Moroccan music. I mean, it's again, it's an example of this convivencia that that when Moroccan music is being played, Moroccan Moroccan Jewish music is being played, Moroccan Muslims feel this is their music. And when Netta comes to Morocco to perform, which she does, she gets unbelievable audiences to attend her concerts. And yes, there's of course a percentage of Islamists, extreme Islamists in in Morocco, and maybe 10% of the country votes for a moderate Islamist party. But the overwhelming sentiment in the country is just unbelievably positive. This event that we had in honor of Mohammed V is in 2015. Still today, when I get to Morocco, whether I'm walking down the street in a big city or in a little village, people will stop me and say, "Wasn't it you who honored our king?" And it's the grandfather of the current king. So many of these people who stopped me weren't even alive when that king was the king. So there's a real positive consciousness um, about Jewish stuff. I was in I brought my congregation, little group from BJ, uh, to Morocco probably 4 or 5 years ago in summer, and it was Ramadan. And Ramadan in the summer is brutal because you're fasting from sunrise to sunset. It's a very long fast, and it's hot. We got out of synagogue in Marrakesh on Shabbat morning. Rabbi Matalon and I were walking down the street past a cafe, and all the men sitting in the cafe were sort of asleep in their newspapers. But as they saw us walking by, they all sort of woke up and said Shabbat Shalom. That's like a normal thing. You tell me when that's a normal thing in New York or in Youngstown, Ohio, or wherever we have Jews. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, but I believe,
Marjorie has a question, Dorothy.
I'm
What
sorry.
is the what is the film that you're talking about? You
It's
referred-
It's on the announcement for this, for today's talk, but if you want, I'll put it back, I'll send it back out again.
There's a film, and where is it? It's on here. It's on
Yeah,
the computer today. Today?
if you click on it, it'll take you to YouTube where you can watch it. And
Chauncey,
Yeah,
may I speak to Peter for
yeah,
1
of
minute to
course.
clarify something?
Sure.
Hello, Peter. My name's Marjorie.
Hi, Marjorie.
Hi, I've been working on our Torah. I'm going to refer back to our Beth-El Torah.
Right.
We have found that it's definitely not from Morocco because of the analysis of the script and the way the columns are produced in it. It is definitely from the eastern part of North Africa, possibly Yemen, or Egypt, or Algeria, or Libya. So I just wanted to clarify that for you, to know that. And we also know that it came probably to us in 1948 as a gift from a member of our congregation. We don't know for sure. So it's still a mystery for us. And I wish we had some more information that we could trace back. But it does have a history of having been in Europe also because of the Torah mantle that was on, even though it's a definitely North African scroll.
Yeah. And by the way, things like that are the story of the Jewish people,
Yes, of
right?
course.
So we don't think about it in terms of a Torah scroll,
Right,
because normally a Torah scroll is made in one place and actually often used in that same place its whole lifetime. So these kind of stories are only involved where Jews began to migrate
right.
someplace else,
That's
and
right.
so that's unique.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank
Thank
you.
you for a wonderful lecture also.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, Dorothy?
I,
I have a question. How did you first become interested in Morocco? Question, first part. Second part, do you know of any other Arab countries in which similar conditions exist?
Okay, so I became what I want to tell you is that I started being distant and disinterested. Um, First, I had a dear friend. Some of you who are contributors to UJA may know my closest friend is John Ruskay, who was recently retired as the CEO of UJA Federation of New York. So John studied Arabic when he was in college, and he spent a summer in Morocco. And he, said to me, wrote me. You remember aerograms? He wrote me an aerogram and said, "Come and visit." And my instinct was, he's in an Arab country, and I don't want to go. Then I had a friend named Seymour Epstein, who was the director of the Joint for 7 years in Morocco, based in Casablanca. And Epi would say to me, "Why don't you come and visit?" Never went. And what happened was that the Kivunim program that I run began with a teacher education program in 1999 in the summer. And originally it was only in Israel, and then it expanded to other countries. And a dear Moroccan friend of mine in Israel, when he heard that we were going all kinds of places and hadn't been to Morocco, said, "You have to go to Morocco." And I said, "I haven't been to Morocco myself. This is a catch 22. So I can't take anybody else to a place I haven't been." So he said, "Well, I'll make the arrangements because you have to go to Morocco." And he did. And so in 2005, my wife and my daughter and I, when she was still in high school, took a trip, and it changed my life. And I would say when I got off the plane, and Rafi took us to the museum, and he started off by saying, here in Morocco we have two groups of Jews, Megurashim and Toshavim, those who were thrown out Jews, the ones who were exiled from Spain, and Toshavim, what they call the settled Jews, Jews who've been there for 2,000 years. So at that moment, I'm a Jewish historian by training. I was Cecil Roth's last graduate student, if that name means anything to you. He was probably the greatest Jewish historian of the 20th century, which means really one of the greatest of all time. I didn't know anything. I mean, I basically, as I said before or alluded to before, I referred in my teaching for generations to the Jews of North Africa as being Sephardic Jews. This is just complete ignorance. So as I stood there and realized in that one little sentence what little I didn't know amongst all that I thought I did know, I realized I had a lot of work to do. And then I discovered that this country was so unbelievably warm and welcoming that it was. I'll tell you this: those students who I worked with I told you about at the university at Alajuane University, today are some of my closest friends. I mean it literally. They're in my home. I relate to them. When I walk when they're in New York and we go out to dinner and I come home, I say to my wife, we're sitting with young people. It's like sitting with our own kids. That's the comfort level. There's no distance. Now um, you asked another question at the end there,
um,
more provocative.
The other question I had was, are you aware of any other country in which these conditions exist in the Arab world?
Yeah. So first of all, uh, in Tunisia, there is an island Jewish community outside of Tunis called Djerba, and on the island of Djerba there is a Jewish community, It's like going to Cuba. It's like walking into the 1950s. The way people dress, look, talk, um, and um, and there you can have a similar experience. And Tunisia in general has a rich attachment to its Jewish history. It just doesn't have as vibrant a community because when the Jews left, Tunisia was a difficult place for a long time because that's where the PLO went. So it was a tough place to be. Um, Ironically, today in Egypt, you have a process taking place of the rebuilding and restoration of synagogues all over the country. You have almost no Jewish community left. So it's really sad. But you have a very positive feeling on the part of the government towards the Jewish heritage. And in Egypt, it's quite a heritage. So, but there's nothing to compare to Morocco because in Morocco, you started off with a huge Jewish community, and they never got wrapped up in the same way in the politics of the Middle East. It was so far away that there was a distance. As a matter of fact, if I can take another 2 moments to give you a startling piece of information that will also be shocking. Um, in 1967, you will recall that the spring prior to the Six-Day War, all the news that we had at this end of the world was very dire. And people were really scared that the state of Israel was going to be attacked and destroyed. And during that same period, King Hassan II, who had a relationship with the Israeli Mossad, invited the Mossad to come to Morocco and occupy the floor in the major hotel in Casablanca, where he had invited the heads of all of the Arab states and their generals to meet to plan the attack on Israel.
Oh
He
my
wanted
God.
the Israel. This what I'm telling you now is not a Baba Misa. The then head of the Mossad wrote a memoir published a couple of years ago. All of this is in that memoir, which, by the way, has also been reported in the Moroccan news and on the Moroccan press as well. So he invited the Mossad to record these meetings so they would know what the plans were. 2 days before that meeting, he got nervous that these Israelis might be discovered, so he sent them back to Israel and he said he would do the recording, which he did. And he supplied that recording to the Israelis. And while we were all worried, and Israelis were actually being made to worry and digging graves in the parks in Tel Aviv in anticipation of the number of deaths, the Israeli Air Force already knew all the plans, and that's why they were able to launch a preemptive strike of the magnitude that they did, and that's really quite extraordinary. And you might say, well, why would they do that? So Hassan II, he felt a great affinity to his Jewish community. He had a large number of Jews in his administration. He still has, Azulai, as I said, sits right outside the door of his grandson, or his son, Hassan II's son. And and second of all, he had, because of all those Moroccan Jews in Israel, he had a very positive relationship with the Israeli security services. And so, you know, there's no relationship that's comparable to Morocco. But what I would say is the following: if we can just solve this Palestinian Israeli problem, the benefits will be far in excess to what any of us might think of. Because the historical nature of the Jewish community, let's just take Iran, for example. I mean, this is Babylonia. This is Mesopotamia. This is Persia. These are the countries where the major forces of our tradition emerged in these areas. So were we to have peace in the Middle East, you really could have a restoration of a historic relationship that would, it seems to me, should be our goal as older people in the community for our children and grandchildren. And we should not put up, I'm a little political here, but I do not think we should put up with a multitude of naysayers who say that, it's black and white, we're right, they're wrong, there's no compromise, etc. All that stuff, because it closes the door on the historic experience of the Jewish people in a really an unbelievable way. We have such potential to come back to something really rich, um, and really powerful.
Well, on that upbeat and hopeful note, I think it's a good time for all of us to thank you really, really
Most welcome.
for a wonderful presentation that enlightened us, engaged us, and has caused us to think and perhaps even come up with more questions that we can send out. If you are hosting any programs in the city or around, please do send us a notice so that maybe some of our congregants can come and listen to you again, or here.
Okay, by all means,
Great
and
luck
enjoy,
and
and
respect.
enjoy Emily. It will be Emily's presentation will be different because she's really going to fill you with a tremendous amount of historical fact, and she knows everything. And her book, The Moroccan Jews, which has just come out recently, is a wonderful book if you really become interested in this stuff. It's a wonderful book. Maybe one of you would look at the book and even have people read at least her introduction, for example, before she speaks. So you'll get a sense of things. She's fantastic.
And so are you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
so very, very
You're
much.
you're most welcome. Take good care.
Many thank yous.
Okay.
Extraordinary,
Thank
fascinating,
you very much.
challenging.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.